I feel so privileged to introduce Reverend Vincent Pizzuto, although I think of him as Father Vincent. He serves both as a professor of New Testament and Christian mysticism at the University of San Francisco, and also serves as vicar at St. Columba's Episcopal Church. I believe I can fairly state that his own special sense of mission is to link the ancient Christian tradition with contemporary faith. That is, regular day-to-day Christians, we've missed out on the riches of that, and that he also works for the advancement of contemplative Christianity. He's cherished as a special resource to contemplative outreach, both at the national level, where he's led 2 events, and he led our fall retreat, so at the Minnesota level. And we brought him back because he just takes us deeper every time. Cherished as that special resource, one of his statements that just convicts me is the crucifixion has made mystics of us all. So let's turn to him to deepen our understanding of that reality. Father Vincent?
Thanks, Jackie, and thank you all for being here today. It's really good to see you all. Just to echo something that Adam had referred to about your cameras, I know at various times, because it might seem distracting, people do turn them off. One of the 2 things I've learned about Zoom that have been difficult is the silence of Zoom mute buttons is deafening. And it is a very different silence than the kind of silence you have when you're physically together with other people. I learned that as we began to return to our evening meditation sessions here at St. Columba's. It was the first time in nearly 2 years that I sat with people in the same room in silence, and the shuffling, the sniffling, clearing throats, ruffling of paper, shifting in somebody's seat, that is the kind of silence that was so life-giving to me. And it really was a contrast to the Zoom silence of absolute nothingness when you're trying to present. And the difficulty of that is, as I'm presenting, typically I have my papers in front of me on the screen, which blocks most of my view from most of you. And not having any capacity for that kind of audience feedback makes it difficult to know where I would want to drill deeper, or where people may be missing the point. There's no real capacity to read you. So I do want to leave spaces open for questioning, and I will try to do that in an organized way, which pushes the questions somewhat toward the end of each of our sessions together, which are relatively brief in themselves. So Zoom is wonderful, and yet not without its limitations. So I want to begin today with a kind of stark reality of where we are right now in the world, this day, this week, the things that we're confronting. We begin today all fully aware of a hostile Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's the likes of which we have not seen in a European capital since the Second World War, and that's very significant. As you've probably seen, the footage coming from Ukraine is as shocking, as depressing. The eerie wail of air raid sirens that are bellowing now over Kiev, the likes of which have not sounded in 75 years. We see panic-stricken Ukrainians attempting to flee their own country, even as men from ages 18 to 60 are being asked to take up arms in defense of their country against a huge military. Helicopters and warplanes have now launched hundreds of missiles around the country of Ukraine, as the president is urging citizens even to make Molotov cocktails to fight back the advancing Russian forces. And this whole new onslaught of tragedy, which in the recent weeks we've been seeing coming on the horizon, which we've been bracing ourselves for, even beyond hope that it could be avoided, all of this is coming in the wake of a continuing pandemic. At a time when the climate is, by all scientific estimations, entering a stage of collapse, in a country in which mass shootings continue unabated, in which terrorism is alive and well, and a history of racism continues to infect even our societies today. So I could go on, as you well know, but the litany of these tragedies and existential threats and war and hatred and injustice has become, frankly, all too familiar. And we see that, we live with that on a daily basis. And these realities have spread to every corner of the world. So this is a stark way to begin a presentation on contemplative practice, but it's an important one because whether we want to or not, we are living in a world in which we have to face what feels like an incalculable, an overwhelming number of tragedies and terrors that befall us on a daily basis. What I want you to notice is that the human response to these issues runs the gamut of anything from social or even climate activism to avoidance and a resurgence of tribalism, to things that we might call medication or distraction and avoidance of all types. We're seeing also the rise of extreme forms of nationalism. We're seeing resurgences of fascism. And no doubt you've all heard or experienced what is increasingly being called compassion fatigue, which is now as widespread as it is prevalent. That idea that we're having a difficult time absorbing what comes at us on a constant daily basis. We don't know what to do with it, what to feel about it, how to respond to it. So with that onslaught of acknowledgement, I just want to pause as we begin. I'm going to ask if we just stop and take a breath, take a nice deep breath, and take all that in. Just be with that reality. I want you to consider how many of you recognize that feeling of almost consistent paralysis, the feeling of powerlessness as you ponder all of these things that are unfolding. I want you to sit for a moment with that sense of discouragement and dismay, even maybe disgust at all these terrors, these horrors that we face on a regular basis. Consider for a moment how you have consciously or maybe semi-consciously turned away, tuned it out. What methods of distraction become your go-tos? A flurry of activities. How do you avoid attending to the world as it really is? This kind of avoidance and distraction is profoundly understandable, and I think eminently forgivable. But today I want to reflect on a different approach, which the title of our presentation, A Love Unflinching, might signal. One that I believe is essentially contemplative in nature, because it flies in the face of the kinds of conventional wisdom that would have us medicate and distract and avoid in the name of what is often referred to as self-care. And in our time together today, I want to invite us to have a conversation about what it means then to cultivate the capacity, essentially, to live with a perpetually broken heart. That sounds very bleak from the outset, but I hope that as we explore today some scriptural passage that I think will help us reframe some of this, we'll see that with this comes a profound joy, if not always happiness, a profound joy. And so while this invitation to live with a perpetually broken heart could indeed sound masochistic, and even psychologically unhealthy, but it strikes me also as profoundly honest and liberating and rich. I want to read just a very brief passage from my book that is sort of grounded in this recognition, this acknowledgement of what I'm talking about here, the way we attempt to be authentic and real and honest around our world and what's happening, and how we can hold out that balm of vigil keeping, as I'll call it. On page 90 of my book, I write this: a spiritual truth to which our culture and society have so successfully numbed us is that the contemplative life is not a luxury or a quaint pastime, but a matter of grave spiritual, social, and even planetary urgency. Contemplatives know this intuitively. The prayer of silence that confronts the tyranny of the false self and opens us to the transforming power of the Spirit is a moral imperative. A moral imperative. So there are several scriptural passages that I want to use as touchstones today on our journey along this conversation of what it means to keep vigil or to cultivate the practice of holding open a broken heart. And in many ways, we might think of it not so much as a meditation on the cross, but a meditation from the cross. And to that end, I want to both read a passage that I gave to you as a point of reflection in the preparatory material, but which I'll read here while posting a beautiful image that I think captures this idea by the 19th century artist James Tissot. And some of you may know him. He had beautiful watercolor paintings of all kinds of images, but most famously is the Tissot Bible, by which he has depicted through watercolor images across the Old and New Testaments, both in richness and beauty. And there's several of those I want to share as I've paired those with each of the readings that I have today. So let me, if I can, just call up this first image for you, and I'll ask you to attend to that and just give yourself a chance to meditate on that as we look at this together. You all see that? Is that big enough on your screens? Try to make that as big as I can. So this is his painting of what he calls the Crucifixion. And as you can see, there is no cross to be seen in this particular image because it is the perspective from the cross that he takes it. And this is what I mean to suggest, that we offer this meditation not on the cross, but from the cross. The idea is, of course, what Tissot is asking us to do is he's inviting us into what the world looks like from the cross. And the particular points, the characters that I'll be exploring, well, here you see at the very bottom, we have Mary Magdalene. We have John, or as he's traditional, the beloved disciple, and the three women, including his mother Mary here up front, who stand in that unflinching gaze of love. Right? This is what I want you to attend to, the importance of this, knowing full well that none of them could change the outcome, could alter the inevitable. But unlike the apostles who ran understandably in fear, these members of his disciples stay. They don't run, they don't turn. They turn to the cross and remain and abide with Christ in this unflinching gaze of love. So as I read the account of this event from the Gospel of John, which for those of you who want to go back to it is chapter 19, 17 through 30, I invite your attention on this picture. Then they took charge of Jesus, and carrying his own cross, he went out to the place of the skull, or as it is called in Hebrew, Golgotha, where they crucified him with two others, one on either side, Jesus being in the middle. Pilate wrote out a notice and had it fixed on the cross. It ran, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." This notice was read by many of the Jews because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the writing was in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. So the Jewish chief priest said to Pilate, "You should not write King of the Jews, but that this man said, 'I am King of the Jews.'" But Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." When the soldiers had finished crucifying Jesus, they took his clothing and divided it into 4 shares, one for each soldier. His undergarment was seamless, woven in one piece from neck to hem. So they said to one another, "Instead of tearing it, let's throw dice to decide who is to have it." And in this way, the words of Scripture were fulfilled. "They divided my garments among them and cast lots for my clothes." And that is what the soldiers did. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary of Magdala. Seeing his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing near her, Jesus said to his mother, "Woman, this is your son." Then to the disciple he said, "This is your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his home. Now, after this, Jesus knew that everything had now been completed. And so that the scripture should be completely fulfilled, he said, "I am thirsty." A jar full of sour wine stood there. So putting a sponge soaked in the wine on a hyssop stick, they held it up to his mouth. And Jesus had taken the wine, and then he said, "It is finished." And bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. As we reflect on this scene, which I will post again for you in your first breakout session, as we reflect on this scene of the crucifixion, it reveals a rare perspective that is often not considered, that of Jesus himself hanging from the cross. And like this painting, understanding the power of vigil requires a change in perspective on our part, a kind of reframing. As you're well aware, we almost always see depictions of the crucifixion from the perspective of the onlookers. But here, what James Tussaud is showing us is the crucifixion without ever really showing us a cross. We see here not then from the perspective of the onlookers, but from the perspective of Christ. And this painting shows a remarkable view of St. John, who was there on the left, and Mary Magdalene, as well as Mary, his mother, who are all in many ways, as we'll see, becoming the church right there at the foot of the cross. And I'll talk about that momentarily. But I want to address what it is that I mean as we reflect on this painting and the associated gospel passage. What is it that we mean by vigil keeping? And as I've noted, it is cultivating the capacity to hold open a broken heart before the world's suffering. There is now a famous saying that I've mentioned in various occasions before, that a broken heart is one that allows the light in. But I think really the opposite is true. A broken heart is what allows the light out. See, in that first analogy, we have this assumption that there is no interior light that we each have, but we do have an inner light. That is the light of Christ within us. And our capacity to hold then a broken heart is not one in which merely we're letting light in as if that's foreign to us, but it is our capacity to let that inner Christ light out. Think about, for example, the parable of Jesus. who talks about we don't light a lamp and then put it under the bed or under a bushel. We put it high on a hillside. That is your light that is being called to shine in your contemplative discipleship. Much as the light within Mary and John and the others at the foot of the cross were shining for Christ in a moment when he most needed that healing balm, that accompaniment, that solidarity from those he loved the most. Very often, I think when we look at all of the litany of global terrors we face, we can feel completely overwhelmed. We can feel completely powerless to do anything in the face of it. And to some degree, there is real truth in that, which is why it's so painful. I mean, if I were czar of the universe, you better believe none of these things would be happening, right? We would all have things run quite differently. But here we are in a world in which they are unfolding. And the question really becomes, how in the midst of that do we hold a broken heart to allow our light to shine in the midst of that? And what I want to communicate to you of most urgency today is that doing that, that apparent nothingness, that sitting and gazing in love with no hope of changing the outcome, that is not nothing. But in fact, it's everything to those who suffer. There is a beautiful insight into the humility of God, who finds himself in Christ in a position of being comforted by his own creatures. A God who is so vulnerable, so humble, as to be rejected by his creation, and to receive the balm of those who he also made, and to hold love light for him in the midst of his own rejection and suffering. And this is a healing balm. Think of the story again that we have in the Gospels, which I'll read again for us in a little while in more detail, particularly in Mark's Gospel. The woman who breaks the alabaster jar, which, for those who don't know, was shaped much like a genie bottle, as perfume jars were. And the purpose of that was to force the slowdown of the flow of the perfumes so that it wouldn't spill if it should tip over. So you have this bulbous bottom and then a very narrow neck, so that when you turn it, just a little drop at a time is permitted to come out. That's to protect the costliness of the ointment. But what she does is she breaks the neck of that and just pours it in one foul swoop over Jesus. And we'll come to that in a moment, but I want you to notice, again, the balm comes from the brokenness of the jar. The balm comes from the brokenness of our hearts. See, that's how it comes out. I think this is a deeply contemplative vocation because it requires of us that patient, that humble, that trusting posture of giving over to providence, of giving over to God what we ourselves cannot control. And I think for many, many contemplatives, we begin to discover as we make our way down the path that letting go of control is one of the most difficult parts of the journey. And we are being asked in the face of some of the worst atrocities to let go of control. Just the way John and Mary Magdalen all had to give up control of the outcome, there was a trust in providence in resurrection. And this is the same that is true of the woman with the alabaster jar. We'll come to that in a moment. But I want to personalize this a little bit in a very recent story, something that just happened this past week, in fact, by a beloved member of my community. His name is Dave, and he lives about 2.5 hours south of where I am in Santa Cruz. I caught word from Dave about a little over a week ago that a cancer that he's been grappling with for years, in which he's been able to fight back in various bouts and remissions, has finally come at him full force. And he is now facing not months, but weeks to the end of his life. I can tell you, I have sat with, I have anointed, I have been with countless people who have faced the same. And I have never seen a person who is facing his own mortality, an imminent mortality, with such grace and beauty and joy and tranquility. It is truly miraculous to me that he could have such a self-possessedness. He invited me to come to Santa Cruz this past Wednesday to offer him an anointing and to pray a Eucharistic liturgy with him and a small group of his closest friends. And of course, I seized the opportunity to do just that. As the liturgy began, I felt, and I think most of us felt, a lot like outsiders looking in at Dave, spectators, really unable to change the outcome of what we knew was happening. And I was uncomfortable with that posture. I was uncomfortable because it made me feel as though Dave was somehow isolated from the rest of us. So during what would have been the homily, I simply spoke the truth that we all knew, but were somewhat afraid to say, that he was dying, and that our culture is so intent on medicating and distracting and avoiding us from that fact, but that at this time, in this moment, to do that, to play that game, if you will, would have been a great disservice to Dave. And I invited each person in that circle then to say what they needed to say to Dave while they still could. And what transformed in that experience was the reality of their broken hearts. They're losing a dear friend. We all are. But the ability to break through the veneer of platitudes and niceness and tiptoeing around his imminent death helped us to strip down all of those niceties. And what it's like breaking open that alabaster jar, and all of that ointment of love and respect and friendship and admiration for who he was and how he had been Christ to them in their lives was utterly and truly a profound experience. As the liturgy progressed, I realized in that moment we were becoming participants in this experience, not just spectators. We were able to both hold him in a kind of silence, but also with the balm of our words, we were able to share with him our own grief at losing him. The participation in his own grief around the ending of his life became a shared participation in what that would also mean for us, who would have to continue to live in this world without him. When the time came to administer extreme unction or last rites, I did so, and then passed the oil to each of the participants and asked them each in their own way to anoint Dave with whatever words came from their heart, or in silence if they felt so. And at the end of that time together, after the shedding of a lot of tears and a lot of laughter and a lot of joy, Dave made this comment. He said, "I will forever remember this moment as the first step on my journey home." What occurred to me is that while I understand we all die alone, we don't have to die in isolation. This is what Dave is teaching me now. We can die in the solidarity of a loving community. Every Saturday morning, including just a few hours ago, I have a weekly Zoom session in which we cover 2 paragraphs of my book in some silent prayer and then follow-up discussion. And I was delighted to see that Dave is feeling well enough to have attended as he normally does. And quite separate from that experience we had in Santa Cruz this past week, I each week invite a practice of meditation or embodied prayer to the community, and then we check back in the following week to see how that went. And because of the topic of the paragraphs I was reading today, I invited everyone in the community this morning to consider praying in the position of orans, which some of you may know is an extension of your arms to each side, your hands raised high, as you might typically see a priest offer the Eucharist. This is one of the most ancient forms of Christian prayer, and it is absolutely intended to be cruciform, raising our hands, stretching them out to each side, our hands raised high, standing. So as we began to log off with that invitation, my eye was drawn to Dave. And he was holding that position. And he had this beautiful look of tranquility on his face, but also this real determination of holding that posture so firmly and so faithfully. And truly, the sight of it moved me to tears. So I wanted to communicate with him my solidarity, my unflinching gaze. So I stretched out my arms, and there we were across this venue. And then in a moment, the moderator had cut the Zoom session. And I wasn't staring at Dave anymore. I was staring at a cacophony of half-written documents and emails, calendar schedules, and all the things that clutter my desktop in my crazy schedule. But I thought for a moment in my mind, okay, time to get on making a cup of coffee, finishing that next email, preparing this, doing that. But there was a little voice that just came up in my head, and I just said, hold this position. Hold this position. And I realized as I stood there, probably looking rather foolish, with my arms outstretched before a cluttered desktop on my computer, that it wasn't Zoom that connected Dave and I, it was Christ. And I closed my eyes and could picture him again in that beautiful posture. There is something healing to another individual to know that they are not alone when they face whatever life has to throw at them. And I thought of this beautiful picture of Tissot that I had been planning to use for today's session, in which there is no image at all of Christ, but rather from the perspective of the crucifixion, which offers us, again, not an image of the cross, but a reflection on the cross or from it. So how do we understand an unflinching gaze, an attentiveness to the suffering of others as an integral contemplative practice that is at once cruciform and yet which can hold that in joy, trusting in providence, trusting in the eventuality of resurrection? The truth of the matter is, I think if we think that we can find happiness apart from this moving through the center of human suffering, we are very much deceived. I think we can find pleasure, but I don't think we can find real joy. And joy is something that abides whether we're happy or dealing with tragedy or sadness. It's something that is much deeper than a feeling. It is more a confident hope, a confident posture of depthful awareness of both our gaze on others and the balm that it is, but their gaze upon us and the balm that that becomes for us. And I think this is what it means to cultivate a broken heart. And as you will recall from the reflection that you began with this morning, just not an hour ago, this, I think, is what I'm referring to when it says this in my book. In the end, ascesis, that is, these ascetical practices, leads necessarily to surrender into the protective shadow of God's wings. And this is why St. Simeon, the new theologian, says, if you feel oppressed, go into a dimly lit and quiet place, lift both hands to heaven, make the sign of the cross over yourself, and lift your eyes of your soul toward God, and the oppression will leave you. There you see that orans that he's talking about. Go into a dimly lit, quiet place and lift both of your hands up to heaven. making the sign of the cross. And there the oppression will leave you. So much of our perceived suffering comes from powerlessness, the inability to change the things we so desperately want to change out of our love for another. And what I want us to consider is this capacity to cultivate a broken heart in solidarity as not nothing, as not powerless. When we move into our second session, I'd like to leave some time for questions before our first breakout. But as we move into our second session, I want to explore how that is, why it is the case that keeping vigil is not merely powerlessness, but an effective way of being in the world, of making a real difference. It's not nothing. It's not sitting back idly, and it's certainly not avoiding or distracting or turning away. But it does what Christ has done for us, enters into the pain and suffering of humanity to bring that divine light, trusting all along that in that we are raised again. So let me then, in the time we have left, just see if there's any thoughts or reflections that we'd like to clarify or maybe move into before I break you into some groups. I want to give, it's what I'm talking about, I think, is a lot of information, and I want to give you some time to unpack that in your own heart. Before we do that, is there anything coming up for someone that you'd like to ask about?
I'm wondering, Vincent, if you could stand back away from your camera and stand in that cruciform prayer, because when you did it before, your arms just went off the screen. I'd just like to see you standing
Sure.
there. Yeah, thanks.
Right. So this is essentially the position, and it could take anything from hands sort of being more close together and raised up, or in the most cruciform sense of that, or sometimes even closer together like this. It's a beautiful posture. And again, it is the most early recorded posture of how Christians were taught to pray. And unfortunately, that form of prayer has been often now reduced to the posture of priests during the Eucharistic gathering, although still many would employ this in many churches during the prayer of the Our Father. Again, a very ancient tradition of doing so. Paula, did I see your hands up, or were you just practicing orons there? You're muted.
I think, Vincent, you may have seen my hand up, but then it disappeared.
Oh, go right ahead.
So you said at the beginning, you posed this question: what does it mean to attend to the world as it really is? And what caught my attention was the word attend to, because I'm going, what does that really look like? I have some ways that I think about that, but you're asking something deeper here. What does that really look like? And I sense that that's where you've been taking us here. And is it this idea of vigil that you're really speaking to, this way of I'm intrigued with cultivating broken hearts, because I do think there's power in a broken heart, and the idea of a broken heart releasing light it really speaks to me. But then how that fits in with our lack of ability to really control anything.
Right.
So that's what I'm bringing.
So thank you, Kathy. To maybe here's the way to put it. I think in many ways throughout history, Christianity has either vertently or inadvertently cultivated the idea of God as kind of emperor of the universe. But I think what the gospel really teaches about divine power is that God isn't emperor of the universe. God is crucified love. And it is precisely that weakness, that failure of that by all worldly standards is the crucifixion, that the power of God ultimately shines. that it is Christ's weakness, or as Paul says, take this thorn away from my side. And the only response he gets is, my grace is enough for you. That all the things we think about ourselves that are weak or stumbling or powerless become the very places where the power of God has the capacity to be effective in the world. And while we are trained in society to think of just sitting there as doing nothing, there's that great Buddhist book that says, don't just do something, sit there. I mean, in a way, there's a real beauty to what that's calling us to really be present. Because as we'll see it after you're back from your meditation, there is a terrible price to pay for a life of distraction. And not only for those whose suffering we ignore, but because you cannot close off the pain of the world without closing off its beauty and its joy and its potential and so forth. I could get on with my life and ignore the fact that my friend Dave is dying. But man, what came out in that conversation, precisely because we didn't flinch, we didn't distract, was the unvarnished truth of love and friendship that had been there, but which had sort of just been latent beneath the surface because you just always think you have forever. But there we had this moment of poignancy. Albert Camus, who says, live to the point of tears. You can't be fully alive if you die to the suffering of others. It's just not possible. A part of you has to die with it, which means you can only live a half life. Now, as we'll see in what I want to say after the break, I'm not advocating a life of dour spirituality or a constant depressive nature or us being, lacking in joy. To the contrary, a life of vigil and keeping vigil and keeping a heart perpetually broken and knowing how to make that space in yourself is what allows also for you to experience the greatest joys, the poignancy, the brevity, the beauty, the fragility of life, without which we're just living a life of distraction and Netflix reruns and whatever else you use to kind of get away from what you don't want to see in the world, right? So it is an invitation to a life lived to the full. But not a life of distraction, of medication, right? I'm going to invite us, and Charlotte, you're welcome to stay behind if you wish. I'm going to invite us then into our time of reflection. What I'd like to do is I'd like to put the Tissot painting available for you, and I will paste in our chat box the questions that I would invite you to consider. I would like to begin this session with another reading and associated with also another painting from Tissot as well. And that is the story of the wedding of Cana. So let me go ahead and call that up for you as a point of reflection while I read for you the story that we see in association with that. Try to make that as big as I can for you and still be on the screen. Okay. So on the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and me? My hour has not yet come." But his mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward had tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. I want to talk a little bit about this passage in relationship to the passage we just read of Mary, his mother, at the foot of the cross. Let me go ahead and stop that so I can see you all a bit. What is the implications here, and why would I call up this idea of a wedding in the midst of an invitation to a broken heart? In this story, his mother, Mary, who is in the same, of course, woman who is at the foot of the cross when Jesus unites her to John, here asks Jesus to perform a sign. There in John's gospel, Jesus performs 7 explicit public signs, or miracles, as they would be called in any other gospel. And in this case, he's turning water into wine. What is fascinating to me is his response to his mother's initial request, right? Which is, "My hour has not yet come." The early fathers of the church offer a really fascinating insight or interpretation into this interesting exchange between Mary and Jesus at Cana. So when Mary observes that there's no wine, Jesus at first refuses her intervention, saying essentially, "What is this to you and me?" In other words, "This is not my business. We shouldn't be involving ourselves here. My hour has not yet come." So the question that the early church asks is, why would Jesus say this? Why not simply agree to her request from the outset, especially since he ultimately would perform the miracle? Basically, say the early fathers, the first disciple of all disciples is Mary, who is indeed the archetypal symbol of the church itself. And what they said is that the church actually isn't born during Jesus's ministry. It's born when he's on the cross. It's born through his passion and suffering, his death and resurrection. And so, in other words, Jesus is saying to Mary, his first disciple, the archetype who becomes the model of Mother Church, that her request is premature. In other words, the church, that is to say, the community of believers, is not yet at a point in which now we are proclaiming the risen Christ, the Christ present in all things. Indeed, the cross becomes, in a way, the birth pangs from which the church community is ultimately born. And of course, in John's gospel, as we just saw in the first reading, Mary has a very intimate role in that birthing of the church, as she, among others, is standing at the foot of the cross. So it is precisely then, says the early church, that in Jesus's dying, that his hour has finally come. And this woman, his mother, Mary, clearly now the personification of the church, there at the foot of the cross, is entrusted to his beloved disciple, and he is entrusted to her. And it's of this union, born, emerging at the foot of the cross, that the church is in fact born. Not at the time of Jesus's infancy, nor his public ministry, but it is born out of his death. As I pointed out many times in the past, one could make the case that Christianity is born not in the creche, but in a graveyard. Christ is risen. This is the earliest proclamation of Christianity, not Christ is born. And so for John, what I want you to pay attention to is that as the Tussaud painting signified for us, the very first act of the church is vigil keeping in the midst of suffering, God's suffering. That's what Tussaud is trying to demonstrate for us. That gaze of the women, of John, of Mary Magdalene, of Mary, his mother, gazing up at him is the first act of the church born of the crucifixion. It is an act of gazing in unflinching love. Its first act is to bear witness to the suffering of God in the world. And in that, the church is born in powerlessness. Mary and John, as we've pointed out, have no power to change the outcome. Jesus will suffer, Jesus will die on the cross. As an act of solidarity, that is to say, vigil keeping, is the cultivation of learning compassion in the midst of suffering without judgment. And in Luke's gospel, this is perhaps best expressed in the final words of Jesus on the cross before he gives up his spirit. Forgive them, Father, they know not what they do. Here, Jesus, the very object of their persecution, is himself offering that great forgiveness, which is beyond the delineations of persecutor and persecuted, but rather embraces all in this plea for forgiveness for all the things we do out of our ignorance. Forgive them, Father, they know not what they do. So to live with a perpetually broken heart, then, is not to condemn yourself, as I was saying earlier, to a life of misery or depression, but to live, to fully live, because we know that despite their powerlessness to change the outcome of Jesus's crucifixion, it is the providence of God that brings all things to fulfillment in resurrection. The story doesn't end, as we know, on the cross. When in the past, some of my parishioners avoided all of the Triduum celebrations from Holy Thursday to Good Friday to the Vigil and show up bright-eyed and bushy-tailed on Sunday, Easter Sunday morning, my comment was always, that's like walking into a movie while the credits are rolling. It's over. You've missed the drama. You don't get to Easter without going through the drama of Good Friday, without the waiting of Holy Saturday, without the painful anticipation of Maundy Thursday. Easter Sunday, the credits are rolling. The Hollywood ending is delivered in full, right? But you have to go through the pain of it all to reach that. If you're really to appreciate the heights of Easter, you have to know the depths of Good Friday. So even in the midst of suffering, it is our vocation as Christians to never let go of the joy, to know that it always ends in resurrection. And that's where we get our strength from. Just like, for example, people who are now ever more saying the future of our planet in the wake of climate collapse is futile. Why bother anymore? It's going down. I don't know if that's necessarily true. I think there is some hope, and I certainly know that there is hope in action, in paying attention and seeing how our own activity is contributing to the problem and how we can amend that. We can certainly ameliorate the worst of it if we try. As Greta Thunberg says, there is only hope here in the action of doing, right? But how do you know what to do? You can't simply throw pragmatic solutions at a global crisis. You have to first do the inner work of seeing the brokenness out of which this situation arises in us, the spiritual disconnect, as it were. But even if it's true, even if it's too late, just like with my friend Dave, who is now terminal, our solidarity, our acts of vigil keeping, our palliative care isn't going to change the outcome, but you don't abandon someone who's received a terminal diagnosis on that account alone. If anything, you attend more deeply to them, more tenderly to them, more present. You allow all the pettiness to fall away, and you move into that deep place of loving solidarity that only death can really define. The beauty is that as we look at the suffering of the world from this place of a broken heart, we are cultivating within ourselves the capacity also to look beyond the duality of victim and perpetrator, of horror and beauty. In some of the readings from Macarius that I gave to you to read beforehand, which I'll sort of hone in on in just a few moments, this is exactly where he says the joy comes from. We want to, and I understand the value and even the temptation of seeking justice, of needing justice, of dividing between perpetrator and victim. But if we're really going to look at the unitive vision of the contemplative mind, we can hold that out while at the same time descending, or perhaps if you prefer, transcending that kind of duality. Not to do this, not to cultivate a broken heart, is, as I mentioned, to live really a half-life. Happiness, perhaps, pleasure, certainly, but joy, not ultimately. I want you to think for a moment of the freedom required by Christ to make that statement as his dying breath, that statement of unity, that lack of judgment, even when he is the object of the persecution. Forgive them, they know not what they do. Imagine the freedom. We talk about Jesus dying on the cross, but what I want to invite you to, as we try to change our lens with Tussaud, as we try to change our perspective or reframe our reflection, not on the cross, but from the cross, is to also acknowledge that Jesus was indeed fully alive on the cross, fully present to his pain, his life, those who are persecuting him, fully alive to his sadness, his suffering, and fully alive to those who gazed back upon him with that healing balm of love. Dave is fully alive right now. And far be it from me to put him in the grave sooner than his cancer takes him. Dave is experiencing a poignancy, a rawness, that if we could all cultivate within ourselves without the threat of a terminal illness on the horizon, we would understand Camus' saying, live to the point of tears, live to the point of fullness of all things. But at the risk of a spoiler alert for those of you who saw the comical, crazy satire, Don't Look Up, which takes the story of a planet killer-sized comet plummeting toward Earth, there is a beautiful thing that unfolds around the main characters of that story as we see the crazy political and scientific clashes and the social uprisings and the denial, the mass denial about what is literally looming on our cosmic doorstep. And throughout the whole movie, the main characters are hysterical, trying to communicate this message to the world, to pay attention, that this is real, that it's coming, that it will happen, that time is of the essence. And of course, spoiler alert, they fail miserably at that. But what is so poignant about the culmination of that film is that as the meteor, now beyond any hope of avoidance, is barreling toward our planet, and the world begins to finally see, far too late, what's befalling us, we see the various vices that the world turns to, the various distractions and medications, while the main characters who all along had been struggling to give voice to the world about the reality that they were hoping to avoid, simply sit around a dinner table and enjoy mundane conversation, knowing that this is their last supper. And indeed, in the midst of I like ground coffee, and oh, this is a delicious roast beef you have here, and oh, what a nice recipe of these potatoes. The end comes. And the last words of the main character is, wow, we sure did have everything, didn't we? We can't all live with the intensity of a meteor crashing into our atmosphere, but we can cultivate the intensity of a life fully lived. That's what it is to live with a broken heart. Think about what it means to otherwise be callous, shut it off, wall yourself in, fortress yourself. What would you have to give up to do that? What would you have to let go of? When I talk about this unitive vision that Christ acknowledges in his own heart and speaks from his dying breath on the cross, forgive them, they know not what they do. One of the desert fathers, Macarius of Egypt, as I mentioned in the reading I gave to you earlier this week, he says this, and I think this is what summarizes it so beautifully. Those who have been deemed worthy to become children of God and to be reborn by the Holy Spirit from above, who have within themselves Christ, illuminating and bringing them rest, are guided in many and various ways by the Spirit. He goes on, they are invisibly acted upon in the heart, in spiritual tranquility, by grace, so that sometimes they find themselves immersed in weeping and lamenting over the human race and pouring out prayers on behalf of the whole human race of Adam. They shed tears and are overwhelmed by grief because they are consumed by the love of the Spirit toward humankind. And at other times, they are so inflamed by the Spirit with such joy and love that if it were possible, they would gather every human being into their hearts without distinguishing the bad from the good. And sometimes they are lifted up in that, in unspeakable joy. So you see, Macarius understood the both-andness of allowing your heart to remain broken, of staying connected to the joys, the suffering, the beauty, the fragility of life. It's that unitive contemplative vision that Christ himself cries out on the cross. I want to focus then before our next break on one other Bible story. And I'll go ahead and I'll call up the picture here for you. Again, taking the reading from the gospel, I want you to see here how Tissot paints this portrait. It's quite beautiful. This is what he calls the Ointment of the Magdalen, which in John's gospel is the first time that the woman who breaks the alabaster jar over Jesus is actually identified with Mary Magdalene, rather than kind of remaining this nameless individual. But here's what the Gospel of Mark says about this, and I read it from Mark because there is this really profoundly beautiful line that only his gospel tells us. While Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment, nard, and she broke it open and poured the ointment on his head. But some who were with her said to one another, "Why was this ointment being wasted in this way? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii, and the money could have been given to the poor." And they scolded her. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has performed a good service for me. You will always have the poor with you, and you can show kindness to them whenever you wish, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for its burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever this good news is proclaimed in the whole world, so too what she has done in remembrance of me. Do you notice how the response of anger that comes from those onlookers is one in which emphasizes pragmatic outcomes? This is a waste of money. This money could have been spent alleviating the suffering of the poor. And Jesus admonishes them for that, right? Jesus has said, he said, something else is happening here, something that is more important. You could take care of the poor whenever you wish, but something else is afoot here. Again, I take you back to the image of a jar, not meagerly poured out through the bottleneck, but snapped, broken, so that the ointment can flow freely. The faith of this woman is even greater than that of the women who come to anoint the body of Jesus on Easter Sunday. It's why Jesus understands that she will be remembered forever. What has she done? She's anointed his body before its burial. And why would she do this? Unlike in the Christian tradition where we're forbidden to anoint a corpse, you can only anoint a living body. In Jewish custom, bodies are washed and anointed precisely for their burial. But what she recognizes, this nameless woman in Bethany, is that this is her only shot. She recognizes through resurrection faith that if she doesn't anoint his body now, she won't have an opportunity. This is an implicit faith in the resurrection, an implicit faith in who he says he is. That's a beautiful story. Sometimes we want to resort to pragmatic solutions. Sell this oil, give the money to the poor. There are real needs in the world, and I understand that. But here, she simply sits at his feet, anoints him in a way she'll never have an opportunity to again, wastes, if you will, this precious balm, but in a way that speaks a healing message to Jesus, who understands the fate that awaits him. Pragmatic solutions make us feel powerful. They're gratifying, and they're inherently good. But they're not always enough, and they're not always possible. And when they're not, allowing ourselves to break open so that that healing ointment can flow from our hearts to another is sometimes the deeper, even more difficult trust in resurrection faith, trust in the providence of God that carries us through all of our suffering to that fulfillment we all seek. One of our own modern day saints, Mother Teresa Calcutta, this is exactly how she spent her life. Her mission was not to save the dying people on the streets of Calcutta, but simply to accompany them. She knew most of them were beyond saving. They were dying of various diseases or starvation or a combination that were irreversible. But she accompanied them, allowing them to die with dignity, walking with them in solidarity. There's nothing pragmatic about that. There's no changed outcome. There's no gratifying solution. There's just being with in the midst of death and suffering and being light. And we can be sure that that was a healing balm to every man and woman and child that she accompanied and that her sisters accompanied. There are many people whose faith has been lost because of the world's suffering. There's a special discipline of theology devoted to that. It's called Theodicy, how we make sense of evil in a world that proclaims a loving God. How do you understand suffering in light of a loving God? It's scandalizing what we need to see, what we have to face, problems we can't solve. Where is God? It's a legitimate question. And as I mentioned, I think what The response that Christianity offers is, there is God hanging on the cross, crucified love. Some of you familiar with Elie Wiesel and his series of books on Auschwitz, the first in particular, Night, which is a profoundly dark and terrifying, although very small book, tells the story of the two men and the young 11-year-old boy who are hung in the gallows for stealing a loaf of bread, because you can imagine they were starving. But the pain of it, of course, is that the Nazis required all of the members of the concentration camp to look unflinchingly. And this was a way to punish them and to deter them from doing the same. And while the two men died instantly, the young boy didn't have enough weight and so hung for quite some time before he finally passed. Excruciating. And in the midst of that, where they were forced to look unflinchingly for an extended period as this young boy died, he heard someone from behind him in the crowd say, "Where is God?" And he said, immediately within himself, a voice rose up and said, "There, hanging in the gallows." That is the most Christian thing I've ever heard a Jewish author say, because that is our very understanding of crucifixion. Where is God? There, hanging on the cross. And all of the suffering we see are the wounds of Christ crucified, urgently needing to be attended to. So I want to dispel the notion that keeping vigil, that unflinching gaze of love, is doing nothing. It isn't doing nothing. Sometimes it's doing everything we can do, because it serves as an act of trust and confidence that through all of this, God has entered into this deep depravity of human suffering with the optimism, the eternal optimism, that in the end, the resurrection makes it right. The resurrection will happen, not just to Christ, but to all of us, and not just to all of us, but to the world itself. So I want to invite you then to consider now in a group of twos, what it means for you to both be the recipient of those loving gazes at a time of suffering. When has it been for you an experience of solidarity and strength and community to receive, as Jesus did on the cross, the loving gaze of those around you, even when they were powerless to do otherwise or to change the outcome? And when has there been an experience for you to be one who gazes, and how has that transformed your relationship with someone, or how has that transformed the experience? I will post a few questions to that order on the Zoom, and I will invite us to then consider that 2x2 walk. And we're going to do this together till about what would essentially be about a half hour. And then we'll come back, and I have just some very short comments then to make before we break into a final session where the two groups of two will come together. Before we break out, are there any questions that are arising from anything I've said in this session that you'd like some clarity on, or further comment or reflection that I might be able to assist you with? Any of the readings or any of the Tissot paintings or any of the concepts? Yes, John, please.
Just could you say something about how we move out of a passivity that isn't active in love? Is it an issue of bringing that unflinching and broken heart into action, into response to the neighbor?
Yes, that's a great question. In many ways, what we're discussing today is one of three ascetical approaches that I offer in the fourth chapter of my book, and therefore is necessarily incomplete, I guess one could say. So the first one looks at the interpersonal love. How does to those with whom I interact on a regular basis? How does that call me to the radical call to love of neighbor? Ruth Burroughs, a Carmelite nun, said, what are all these artificial practices of asceticism you all adopt? Your fasting and your all this stuff. Nothing compares to that daily practice of loving neighbor and learning to love neighbor through all of their foibles and shadow sides and limitations and irritating qualities. So first we adopt that love of neighbor and learn to love one another through that. And then secondly, what does it mean to love impersonally? What does it mean to love someone from a state you've never been to and know no one from? And I'm suggesting in that case, again, action. That is to say, help to create a society in which all can thrive, in which human needs are met, in which the earth is cared for, and so on, in your own actions, but also in public policy and laws and so forth. So there's that. And then we're left with this third piece, which is what happens when I have no power. What's happening in Ukraine, for example? I mean, there's nothing any of us could literally do to alter the course of what's happening in Ukraine. What do I do in the face of that frustrating experience? And so my response to you is to say, to first of all, to try to understand God works through powerlessness. This is the meaning of the cross. And that powerlessness is getting out of the way, is abiding in optimistic trust that God will work regardless. And therefore to hold the gaze rather than to detract from it. But certainly wherever it is possible for action to make a difference, I wouldn't suggest we refrain or withhold from that. That's the broader piece of those other parts that I'm trying to talk about. But I think, again, I think most of us desire control. I mean, even if it's benevolent control, right? If I could control Russia's army right now, I would halt the army, right? That at least I would feel that's the most benevolent thing to do. So whenever we're in life, whether it's in immediate circumstances or global context, it's the lack of control that is just utterly painful to endure especially when there's suffering involved of animals or people or the environment. So it's to encourage us to understand the value of keeping vigil is not inaction. Distracting is inaction. Medicating is inaction. Keeping vigil is a form of action that puts its faith in the here and now and trusts in the providence of God, knowing that our powerless cannot render an immediate action that would somehow satisfy or satiate that deep down, even benevolent desire. But it is definitely, again, it's part of this is a recommendation that's part of a larger palette, and where action is viable, take it. Right? This is what Mary and Martha do. I mean, when Martha greets the so-called dear guest Christ, as Eckhart says in his sermon, she is the contemplative in action, because she's not clinging to her contemplative practice of just sitting in silence like Mary, blissfully at the feet of Jesus. But she understands as a contemplative in the world that sometimes love demands you even put aside your practice, your meditation. You give up the bliss of that silent solitude with Christ to serve the need in front of you, who is Christ. But then we reach those terrible moments where I can't put Dave's cancer into remission. I can't change the course of the Russian military. And we have to sit with that agony, because otherwise we close ourselves off to the beauty of life as well. And my admonishment to all of you is not to think of that as nothing. It's something, and it's real, because it gives over to God in a deep trust in resurrection, just like, the alabaster jar, anointing him now, trusting that she won't have an opportunity. That's an implicit faith in the resurrection to come. And there's something profoundly beautiful there. The three women who go to the tomb on Easter Sunday, they're expecting to find a body. She wasn't. She knew better. Yeah. Something beautiful about what she did that day. Does that help, John, a little bit? Okay, thank you. Let's see. I think I saw another hand up, or at least it had been. Did I answer?
Kim's hand was up for a time.
Oh, go right ahead.
You answered my question. Thank you.
Okay, I love when that happens. Thanks, Kim. All right. Any other thoughts before we break for our second breakout session? I'm happy to try to clarify. Lords, there you go.
Yeah. Hi. I'm curious, and it actually just sprung from the last question.
Mhm.
How do we know in ourselves the difference between Martha in action, in service, and kind of active distraction?
Yeah, it's a great question. And did you want to ask further, or can I respond to that as okay? Yeah, this whole chapter, of which I'm literally discussing, I think the last page and a half in our session today, is all about our grappling with so-called demons. And one of the things we learn in the contemplative life is the many and various ways they have of deceiving us. There's a Buddhist sort of proverb that says the most difficult part of meditation is finding the cushion. In essence, there's every imaginable reason why I should not get onto that meditation bench this morning will assail me until I actually just say enough, and I do it, right? So the shorthand is one could easily be deceived in this way, and in a million ways. But this is a real interesting way, because it could give the appearance of, oh, I'm a contemplative in action, and this is what I should be doing now. But really, it's just a pious excuse for meditation, for distraction rather. So I think one of the discerning qualities is to understand the difference between distraction and service, loving service. On the one hand, I don't think contemplatives in the world should burden themselves with the type of practices that we would see in our monasteries. I think it is a recipe slated for disaster. When we're busy raising children, holding down jobs, paying mortgages, maintaining a household, it's untenable that we could hold a commitment to the regularity of prayer we would as monastics. But the question is this: are you holding what for you in your way of life is a regular, committed, faithful practice? And as long as you're maintaining that, then when you are called to serve the dear guest Christ, it becomes certainly at times we could argue a replacement for, I'm about to meditate and a neighbor in need comes to the door and I attend. But then the question is, does that become the exception or the rule? And so we would have to take that. Is that becoming just a tempting way, a pious excuse to get me out from the cushion? Or is it becoming a need that I respond to in the midst of a neighbor who has a real, genuine need from me? And I don't think there's a blueprint for that. I think we have to pay careful attention to the overriding quality of our practice and attentiveness to it. And that's how we answer it in that larger context of our commitment. Does that help, Lords? Okay, I can see you back there. All right, good. Yeah. Be very careful about the ways in which we can distract ourselves. They are numerous, abundant, and never-ending. Okay, so let's then go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and post for you all some questions for our Emmaus walk. Again, these are questions to consider. Don't be literalist about this. If you find that your conversation with your partner takes you in other directions that are equally as poignant, then let the Spirit guide you. But allow yourselves to be vulnerable in this. Open up and have that conversation so that you can bear some fruit. And that will take us to about a half hour from now. So we looked essentially at unpacking 3 scriptural texts in light of this question: what does it mean to keep to cultivate the practice of a perpetually broken heart in our daily life as Christian contemplatives? We looked at the wedding of Cana as a way to suggest that in John's gospel, Mary's request is premature because, as the early fathers said, although she is the first disciple and becomes the archetypal mother, symbolic of the church as a whole, her question is premature of Jesus to perform this sign. But what John does is carries that story through to the crucifixion, where Mary herself, along with others, as we saw in the Tissot picture, is there present as the church is born at the foot of the cross. The birth pangs of the church become the suffering and death of Jesus, where before his passing, he gives over Mary to John and John to Mary. And there the church is born in that beautiful context and poignantly painful context. And a reminder that what that text speaks to us is that the church is born in the midst of powerlessness. The first act of the church is vigil keeping, that is to say, bearing witness to God's own suffering in the world. And it is Jesus who, in a different context, Luke's gospel, sort of offers us, I think, a clue to that unified contemplative vision, to look beyond perpetrator and victim, to hold the whole world, as Macarius would say, in weeping and in joy, in this love of God. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. And then I explored also with you the other passage of the anointing at Bethany, which again, the woman at Bethany becomes archetype for all of us would-be contemplatives who learn not to be stingy with that balm of compassion, not to seek merely pragmatic solutions to problems, especially when there are none to be had, but to understand our hearts must break like that jar of ointment in order for us to become that healing balm that we release on others who are suffering. And that presence of solidarity becomes real for those who are its recipients. And that her action, like ours, can find, even in those dark moments, that we hold on to that eternal optimism of resurrection, that Christianity both understands human suffering, a history of suffering, but yet remains eternally optimistic because of our professed hope or faith, if you want to say, in the resurrection. So that's, in a very quick nutshell, what I hope to kind of walk you through today and what I've been trying to unpack with you in our previous two sessions. But what I want to share with you in this final paragraph then, before turning to just a few questions before we have our final breakout, is again the last paragraph of this section on keeping vigil, at the very last pages of this fourth chapter on Christian asceticism. What I want to tell you is that while I needed to edit this paragraph to make sense in the context of the book itself, its original context was a pastoral letter that I wrote to my community, New Skellig, which I had founded back in 2006, in the wake of the Sandy Hook shootings, right? So we can see that what I'm trying to write and communicate in this paragraph has a real world origin in what, for all of us, was just an incalculable sense of suffering and grief in the wake of those horrific acts. And I was really torn with what to say to my community. We were all hurting. I was shell-shocked. We were stunned. It was profoundly depressing. But I knew that if I were feeling this, so too were my sheep of the fold, as it were. And I felt a need to try to reach out and to be present to them, to offer some of that hope or optimism in the midst of something that was so mystifying and so incomprehensible. So I want you to understand that while I did, of course, need to edit this slightly for the context it's in, there is a real world event behind this, and it's the same type of events that I began my conversation with today, just different iterations of it. And this is what I came to. Solidarity with those who suffer is impossible without the deeply personal act of vigil keeping, whereby we consciously remain present to the experience of another. Who is to benefit if we are crucified to the world in an abstract or impersonal sense? Rather, it is your heart that must be allowed to break with the hearts of mothers and fathers, spouses and siblings, in whose loved ones Christ has been crucified yet again through some new act of persecution or violence. And that is why vigil keeping is perhaps the most rigorous ascetical practice the contemplative life will demand of you. With Macarius, who we heard from earlier, it is you who must gather every human being into your very heart without ever distinguishing the bad from the good. It is you who must refrain from the duality of judgment and accusation so as to enfold both victim and perpetrator in the tender mercy of God. And with relentless compassion, it is you who must hold out this contemplative gaze with weeping and tears and dread. And as you do, reveal to all whom you encounter that the world is beautiful still because you make it so, because your love makes it so. That's what I want you to hold on to as you consider these practices of vigil keeping. It is your love that makes the world beautiful, that insists, despite all evidence to the contrary, that God is present in the midst of another suffering, because you embody that in your vigil keeping. You embody that divine love, that balm, that optimism when others can't, because their grieving is too strong or their suffering too great. It is your love that makes that insistent claim, Christ is risen. I hold you with that, and I hope that that can give you, in this brief conversation we've had today, a way as to reframe what we think of as a meditation on the cross, not merely upon us looking at Christ crucified, but as each of us, as Christ crucified, seeing that healing balm of those who can change nothing of the outcome, but who can remain that ongoing presence in solidarity. And that's where the love of God continues to shine despite everything in you. And that's no small thing. To the contrary, it's deeply powerful and transformational. So let me then invite any sort of thoughts or questions that you may have, or just comments that might be helpful to clarify any of this for you, or to just reflect together. I know we have only a brief time left together, and I know that Adam and all want us to have some time for those pairs to meet up. But Rolf, go right ahead. I think I saw your hand up, and you just want to make sure you unmute there.
Okay. In the passage that you just read, the quote from Macarius, without distinguishing bad and good, I find that very troubling. Don't we sometimes have to make precisely that distinction?
Yes, sometimes I think we do. And to your point, to take something very real, what's again the issue in Ukraine?
Vladimir Putin.
Yeah. Full confession, for most of my life, I strove for what I would regard as a pacifism, to be a pacifist. And part of me doesn't want to let that go, doesn't want to compromise that. But the truth of the matter is, I am stuck with a question that I sometimes can't answer when I think about what it means to be a real pacifist. And that is it sometimes immoral to be a radical pacifist? Are there times when we are forced to use force to prevent the extermination of 11 million people, for example, as we saw in Nazi Germany? If in the early 1930s, I'm driving down a country road in Germany, and I had a crystal ball and Hitler walked in front of my car, do I hit the brake or the gas? In many ways, it's obviously theoretical, but if I could see the outcome, is there not some moral obligation to intervene when the horrors that could unfold because of an individual or that person's regime are so extreme? I don't know how to answer that question. But the context in which Macarius is speaking is on a different level. It's on the level that requires us as Christians to hold out the fact that God's goodness, love, and compassion, and that our image of that God, no matter how twisted or distorted, remains the fundamental identity of every human being, no matter how horrific. And despite how much the Putins and the Hitlers and whoever else have fallen from that image, have marred that image beyond recognition, sin and its effects are always a second moment. That, before original sin, there is original goodness. That core, I think it was, who's the Jewish girl who wrote, Anne Frank, who said, she believed that we're like loaves of bread, where even when they're stale, at the very, very center, there's still a soft core there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's from that conviction, which insists that no matter how horrible, God's love is bigger, God's compassion is bigger. Otherwise, we are implicitly making the claim that evil is bigger than God. And now we've really fallen into despair, and rightfully so. So we have to make a distinction, I think, for when we can act, and then the moral guidance that would allow us to act, and under what context and with what parameters. Whether that means imprisoning war criminals or so that they can't continue to do it and so forth. But Macarius is really looking that even when we must take those actions for the defense of a country or innocent people, we can't lose sight of the fact that even the ones we call the perpetrators are images of God, because to lose that is to lose our own souls. And Rolf, I won't pretend that I have a clearer answer than that. The would-be pacifist in me struggles with that question of the gas or the brake pedal all the time.
If I could just add something, a gloss onto that, I think it is possible to kill someone with your heart open, not with righteousness for your act, but with compassion for the person who is dying.
Right. That's right. And how do we, somebody asked earlier, how do you know when, it was Lord's, how do you know when you're just using an excuse to help the neighbor as a way to not get onto the meditation bench, right? The inner ways we deceive ourselves. How do we remain grounded in compassion and mercy while exacting just punishment, even if that punishment, again, is to just simply to protect the larger society who is threatened by a particular individual, a war criminal, and to do that while still holding that conviction that they are an image of God, and not allowing what appears to be justice to be blind revenge. And believe me, I'm speaking autobiographically. I mean, the truth be told, if somebody assassinated Putin, I wouldn't cry about it tomorrow. I'm just frank with you about that. And I can't muster the compassion in myself, given what's happening, to pretend otherwise, because now I'm just lying to myself. But that's where I have to check what Macarius is asking me to do, which is to see him as an image of God and to mourn what he's become.
And he must be suffering profoundly.
Has to be. Has to be. It's all suffering.
Oh, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have one brief comment, Vincent, which is, if I am in the midst of suffering and others are keeping vigil for me, it's hard to receive that if I am distracting myself with busyness, with whatever. As I was thinking of the moments when I was in suffering and people were were keeping vigil for me, supporting me, connecting with me, I can distract myself from that too. And so there's something there also for staying open while I'm suffering.
Adam, I think you really point to the insidious ways in which our desire to control can even become self-destructive. I mean, how many people do we all know who have an easier time giving than really receiving, which is, I think, what you're talking about. And I think there's a control element. I don't want to feel vulnerable. I don't want to be needy. I don't want to become a burden. I don't want to appear, like I'm unable to sort of, pull myself together. And that in itself is the flip side of distraction, of the inability. And one of the things that has moved me to tears with my friend Dave, who I spoke of earlier, is how graciously he's receiving this balm that's coming at him, not with self-pity, but with joy and gratitude, in a way that he's a teacher to me. I hope I can die with the grace that he's now assumed in this process. And part of it is his capacity, when I invited those in that circle to speak their love to him and who he is and what he means to them, not to flinch, not to reject it, but to simply receive it with such openness and joy. It was profoundly beautiful. It was not a depressing conversation. Moving, touching, tearful, yes, but not depressing. Unvarnished truth. Love. In the wake of 9/11, a Jewish rabbi who was near the buildings, whose synagogue was actually destroyed in part from the falling debris, started a practice of collecting all of the transcripts of the last words that people spoke on home recorders or on emails to their loved ones, knowing they weren't going to get out of the building. And he says, why do I chant this with my morning prayer along with the prophets and Torah? Because this is sacred scripture. This is what people say when all the BS is washed away, when all the pettiness, when all the family dynamics, when all the dysfunction falls away and I'm facing my demise. All that comes out of us is love. To hear this rabbi chant these words, profoundly beautiful. To be a contemplative is to live with the intensity of that kind of expression of love, not just when we're under the threat of imminent death or tragedy or sadness, but to be able to live on the edge of that at all times, to really allow ourselves to be alive and awake, to tell our loved ones how much they mean to us, how much we love them, and to get out from under all the pettiness that can so often consume our most intimate relationships. I tell my students the last day of every week of the class that their homework is to go home, look in the mirror, and tell themselves they're gorgeous. And they're totally embarrassed. They're totally shy about doing that. But tell your kids they're gorgeous. Have you ever done that? See what happens. They need to hear it, right? Live with that intensity, because there is also what it means to live with a heart broken, a heart opened. And I called up, a saying, a sort of reflection that most of you may have heard, but I want to remind you of it in this context, in light of both what Adam and Ralph are saying. And it's a brief reflection that apparently was found written on a piece of paper in the jacket of a coat of a young girl in Auschwitz. And so that context is important, but I want you to hear this because I think it responds to what both of you are saying. It's a prayer. Oh Lord, remember not only the men and women of goodwill, but also those of evil will. But do not remember all the suffering they have inflicted on us. Remember the fruits we have borne thanks to this suffering, our comradeship, our loyalty, our humility, our courage, our generosity, the greatness of heart which has grown out of all of this. And when they come to judgment, let all the fruits that we have borne be their forgiveness. That is Macarius on a small note in the pocket of a young girl who was killed in Auschwitz. This is what she's getting at. So I'd like to just offer in closing, first of all, I guess a question. Maybe you can share an emoji or a thumbs up and down. Were those conversations helpful for you? They were. Okay, good. It's helpful, I think, to try to process some of the theoretical and scriptural and theological things that we're talking about. I see the question coming through from Jackie. Adam, you now have that quote that I had just read from that prayer, and you'll be sending that out to everyone, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So yeah, Jackie, and all that last quote, that prayer is coming your way. And Adam also asked me to share some links of various things that I'm presenting on and doing. So he'll go ahead and send those out for any of you who have questions about the blog or the church or anything like that, just for your information. Firstly, I want to thank you for being here today and indulging me this conversation around what it means to live with a broken heart, a conversation which could easily be misunderstood as dour and depressing and fatalistic. But really what I'm hoping you're taking from this is that vulnerable, supple way in which we remain open to the whole gamut of life, the beauty, the joy, and the suffering, and to really understand as a contemplative practice that perpetual state of an open heart is what it means to live fully and to live completely. So I invite us then in the closing moments to just take a few deep breaths and to bring ourselves into the place of our own heart. And especially into a place in which we know our heart is wounded, is broken, and to just think of that place that you hold. And rather than try to avoid or distract, to really enter into it. Live into it. We learn in the story of doubting Thomas that Christ comes into his resurrection, wounds intact. But those wounds become for Thomas and others places of transformation, places in which we take shelter. So I invite you then to consider how a wounded heart, a broken heart, becomes the place from which your light shines in the world. And to risk that heart, that vulnerability and that brokenness as a way toward living fully in the hope of the resurrection. And let us pray. God, with broken hearts, we present ourselves to you. We stand at the foot of your cross. Teach us to gaze with unflinching love at all of the wounds being perpetrated even now around the world, and those we know and don't know. And allow us the grace to stand unflinchingly before you, to become that balm of love, that healing ointment for a world desperately in need of your grace and your light. And we make this prayer in the name of the Three in One and One in Three. Amen. So thank you all for being here with me. I hope to see you all again. We have a lovely saying here at St. Columba's from the Celtic tongue, Ben Christ in it, I greet Christ in you. So I greet Christ in each and every one of you today. You are for me the face of Christ, and I send you off with my blessing in the name of the Three in One and One in Three. Amen. Be at peace and be brokenhearted and be joyful. Amen. Thank you.